Alright, 5-second intro. Kids at Play Part 2. Let's continue. Here we go. This was especially tiresome since Mrs. Linden was a talker. Ah, yes. We're talking about all the different customers who go to the gardening center that our main protagonist works at for some reason. Sure hope we get to the actual scary part soon. She rambled constantly about everything that was going on in her life, about her grown kids and their problems, about her aches and pains and doctor's appointments, and, of course, about every minuscule thing that happened in her huge garden. Who the hell cared about all this stuff? Joel sure didn't. He hated listening to the old lady's cracked voice. And on top of Mrs. Linden constantly running her mouth, she was a complainer. She found fault with something every time she came in, and his dad always bent over backward to make her happy. Joel cringed every time he had to listen to one of their exchanges, which always went something like, "Those seeds didn't sprout on schedule, Stephen." And his dad said, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Linden. Here's a new packet of them, on the house." Or this, "My hyacinths aren't as rich in color as I'd hoped they'd be, Stephen. I don't believe this fertilizer is doing its job." And his dad says, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Linden. How about I give you a small bottle of another type of fertilizer for you to try? No charge." After witnessing this several times, Joel finally asked his dad, "Why does she bother coming in here all the time if our stuff sucks so bad?" His dad smiled and shook his head. "It's just her way. She buys much more than I give to her." Now Mrs. Linden was leveling her gray-eyed, squinty stare at Joel. "You do realize that your casual gravel kicking just resulted in a divot in my fender," Mrs. Linden said, pointing at a microscopic speck in the pale blue paint of her ancient Ford LTD. The thing was a boat on wheels. Joel opened his mouth to tell her where to stick her divot, but out of the corner of his eye he saw his dad step out of the garden center. Joel and Mrs. Linden were close enough to his dad that his dad could hear what they said. Joel blew out air and bent over to brush his thumb over the speck. Thankfully, the speck was dirt, not a divot. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Linden," he said, practically choking on every word. "I shouldn't have been so careless. But it's just a bit of dirt, not a divot. How about I wash your car for you tomorrow after I get off work?" Mrs. Linden beamed. "That would be lovely, young man." She shuffled over to Joel's dad. "A nice boy you have there." Joel's dad quirked his lips, but nodded. Joel rolled his eyes and dashed to his truck as soon as Mrs. Linden took another step toward his dad. Jumping into the car, he stuck his key in the ignition and commanded "Start." Amazingly, it did so on the first try. Joel put the truck in gear, and because he could almost literally feel his dad's gaze on him, he backed up slowly. He ever so carefully turned the wheels to head out of the parking area. He was towing the line perfectly today, so much so that it was the first thing he said to Zach when he pulled up to Zach's family's old barn. Zach was outside, at the corner of the barn, putting seeds in the bird feeder when Joel arrived. Joel could see Zach had already spread out fresh hay for the goats. One of the goats, Missy, a tan-colored nanny who would eat your clothes if you didn't watch her, was already chowing down. The air smelled similar to the way the nursery smelled. It reeked of dirt and manure with a hint of sweetness that came from the honeysuckle growing against the faded and warped boards along the barn's south wall. "Dude," Joel called as he got out of his truck, "I'm towing the line today. How about you?" Zach turned and laughed. "No, I'm stomping all over the lines." Joel laughed and reached through the cab of his truck and grabbed the handle of his battered guitar case. "Everyone here?" he asked Zach. Zach shook his head, and his long, straw-colored hair flipped across his face. He brushed it aside with a large hand. He was a big guy, even taller than Joel. He was the kind of dude you didn't want to cross. The center of the high school football team, Zach's muscle mass didn't come from working out, it came from working on his parents' farm. He was pretty strong. He also was a great musician. He didn't look like it because he was big, tanned, and had rough features, but Zach could play the piano and keyboard with more heart than anyone Joel had ever heard. Zach closed the lid on the bird feeder. "Evan's girlfriend has a thing. He'll be here in an hour." "We don't need him. I can sing lead until he gets here." "Figured." "Pizza come yet?" Joel asked. "I'm starved." Wes talked me into ordering today so it wouldn't be cold when Evan got here. Zach headed into the barn, and Joel followed him. "Wes!" Joel shouted at his short, curly-haired dolt of a friend. "What were you thinking, dude? I need food." "It's not all about you, Joel," Wes said. "Stick it in your ear." Joel set his case on a bale of hay and took out his guitar. He crossed to one of the amps set up at the back of the barn, plugged the guitar in, and left it leaning against a couple spare tires stacked against the wall. He didn't play guitar in the group that often. Mostly he was the drummer. Sometimes, though, he and Evan switched out. Evan was a passable drummer, and he could keep the beat when Joel really wanted to be on the guitar. Joel watched Wes concentrate on a riff he was working on, his dark brown hair flipping over his pale face. "Sick," Joel said when Wes stopped playing. Zach sat down at the keyboard. "Are we starting?" Joel took his seat behind the drum set. He and Wes followed Zach's lead into the song they'd been practicing the night over. The barn had surprisingly good acoustics, and Joel was lost in the music within seconds of beating the skins. Evan arrived around the time the pizza arrived, and after they all stuffed themselves on pepperoni and pepperoncini pizza, they returned to playing. They jammed until Joel glanced at his watch just after midnight. "I gotta quit early tonight," he said. "My freaking dad has forced me to get up before dawn to work." Wes sat down his guitar and stretched. "Hey, be glad you have that job. I'd kill to work for someone like your dad." Joel grimaced. "You don't know what you're talking about. My dad's a slave driver." "You've never flipped burgers at BJ's. Now that guy's a slave driver," Wes groaned. "Minimum wage for working over a dirty, hot grill, getting yelled at all the time because you're not doing it fast enough." "At least you don't have to shovel manure," Joel said. Zach laughed. "I think you're shoveling some yourself, Joel." He got up from the keyboard and shook his head. "You've got a great life, dude, and instead of appreciating it, you're always grousing about it. You're in such a hurry to leave it behind." Joel frowned at his friend. "You want to get into the music scene, too. You said you couldn't wait for us to get out on our own." "Well, yeah, but that's a figure of speech. I'm looking forward to it, but I can also appreciate what I have now. I just think sometimes your anger blinds you to what's good is all." "What the hell do you know about it?" Joel snapped. Zach held up his hands in surrender. "Dude, just saying, if you slow down in life, you can enjoy the scenery on the way to where you want to be." Joel snorted. "Who are you, some kind of guru?" When Zach just smiled and shrugged, Joel slammed his guitar into its case and stomped out of the barn. Joel was grinding his teeth when he got into his truck under a star-filled sky and a quarter moon. Where did Zach get off telling Joel what to do? Joel got enough of that from his parents. "See you guys tomorrow night," Evan called as he and Wes headed toward their own vehicles. Joel grudgingly waved at his friends, pulled out, and headed toward the gates of Zach's family farm. He could see Evan's headlights behind him. Evan drove an old red sports car that had bug-eyed headlights set close together. Tall and lanky, Evan barely fit into the thing, but he loved it. He inherited it from his grandpa. Too bad Joel didn't have a grandpa. His parents' were all dead. Long dead. He hadn't inherited squat from any of them. How was that fair? Behind Evan's little car, Wes's jacked-up truck shot light over the top of Evan's car and in through Joel's rear window. The searing light reflected into his eyes from the rearview mirror, pissing him off. He should have a big truck like Wes's instead of this old piece of crap. He shoved his foot down the accelerator in anger, and as he shot through the gates of the farm, he fishtailed out into the country road and punched it back toward town. Rattling just enough to piss him off even more, Joel's truck attempted to reach 80 miles per hour on the straight stretch of narrow road that ran along the edge of the farm on one side and an old forest on the other side. If Evan or Wes had been coming this way too, Joel was sure they would have caught up to him in a nanosecond and blown him off the road. Thankfully, though, they lived on the other side of town, and they took a different route home. Lowering the passenger side window so he could feel air rushing through the cab, Joel let out a shout. Whether it was a shout of rage or a shout of glee, he couldn't have said. His emotions were a mess. He hated his truck, but he was loving the feel of its 435 horsepower engine rumbling under his control. The country road leading back to civilization came to a fork in the road near town. One branch of the Y led to more farms spreading out into the valley. The other led abruptly into one of the town's outlying subdivisions, an expanse of 20-year-old ramblers that all looked alike and sat too close together. Joel hated the subdivision, but even though the speed limit in the area was just 25 miles per hour, cutting through it got him home faster, and he needed to get back and catch some sleep if he was going to make it to work before dawn. Joel slowed as he downshifted for the turn to the subdivision, but he didn't slow enough. Just as he had earlier in the week, he slid around the corner, out of control. Fighting to keep the truck on the road because he was sure as heck didn't want to go in the deep ditch he knew ran along the shoulder here, Joel cursed at himself for being so reckless. He knew better than to take the corner at this speed. At one point, he felt the tires coming off the road, and for a split second he thought that the truck was going to flip. His heart stopped beating for an instant, but then the truck settled, even though it was still in a skid. Joel let the truck have its way with the asphalt, and he even began enjoying the adrenaline rush off the slide. He enjoyed it, that is, until he saw the child caught in his headlights. A child? What in the hell was a kid doing out after midnight? As soon as he saw the kid, Joel slammed his foot on the brakes. He didn't even downshift, he just hit the brakes. The truck bucked, but it didn't slow fast enough. The front bumper slammed into the child with a thud that seemed to reverberate through the truck and right into Joel's body. Oh no. Okay. As soon as he heard the impact, Joel wanted to squeeze his eyes shut and pretend he was someplace else, but he couldn't. It was like his gaze was tied by a string to the trajectory of the child's body as it flew up and out away from the truck and then disappeared off the road. He assumed they landed in the deep ditch just off the pavement. The truck lurched to a stop, and because Joel hadn't depressed the clutch, the engine died. A few clicks sounded from under the hood, and Joel's panting breath filled the cab. Outside, crickets chirped. In the distance, a dog barked. Joel forced himself to quiet his breathing. He needed to listen. Was there any sound coming from the ditch? Was the kid... Joel closed his eyes tight, but that didn't do anything to make what just happened go away. As soon as his lids came down, his mind replayed the impact of his truck against the kid in slow motion. Joel was able to see details he'd missed when it happened in real time. In this slow-mo replay, Joel was able to see that the kid's body was small. The kid couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, maybe, and what was it, a boy or a girl? It was impossible to tell. The kid was wearing dark pants, maybe jeans, and a dark jacket. She... Joel decided to stick with it, thinking it didn't feel as bad as he or she. Again, what in the hell was a kid doing out at this hour? Joel sat behind the wheel and thought about the body his truck had just tossed into the ditch. He should get out and check on it, shouldn't he? Of course he should. But he couldn't. He just absolutely couldn't. The very thought of trying to get out of his truck made him start to shake. No, that wasn't true. He already was shaking. But the idea of getting out of the truck made him shake even more intensely. The entry to the subdivision was flanked with 2 big stone monument-like signs that announced the subdivision's name, Glenwood Fields. A decorative area, filled with seasonal flowers, daffodils now, surrounded the signs. The first houses on the street were well beyond the decorative area. This meant no houses looked directly out at the corner, and even the nearest houses were dark. No one seemed to be up, except the crazy kid in the middle of the road. Joel realized he was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his palms were starting to hurt. He let go of it and stretched his hands. "What are you gonna do, dude?" he asked himself out loud. His stomach felt heavy. The pizza he'd eaten was gurgling around and threatening to climb back up into his throat. He pressed a hand to his stomach. What should he do? For some reason he glanced in his rearview mirror, and his decision was made for him. Headlights were coming down the country road, heading toward the corner. No way was he going to be caught sitting here. His legs feeling weak and rubbery, Joel managed to position his feet on the clutch pedal and the brake pedal. With a trembling hand, Joel reached for the key and turned the ignition. To his surprise, it started immediately. Joel put his hands at 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock on the steering wheel and eased out of the clutch as he gently accelerated. As soon as the truck was rolling, he sped up, and in spite of what had just happened, he raced home at double the posted speed limit the whole way. Joel should have fallen asleep the second he threw himself on the bed. He was beyond tired. Apparently, however, he was so beyond tired that he'd circled back around to wide awake. His eyes just wouldn't close. It was like they were taped open or something. Most Friday and Saturday nights, because of the long days and late nights playing music, Joel went to sleep so fast that he'd wake up the next morning on top of his covers in the exact same position as when he fell into his bed. This drove his mom crazy, usually triggering one of her "why did we bother" lines. Why do we bother getting you nice sheet and blankets when you're just going to sleep on top of them? Joel turned over for the 3rd time since he'd flopped in his bed. It didn't do any good. He was still wide awake. No matter how much Joel squirmed around in his bed or scrunched and re-scrunched his pillow to get his body in a comfortable position, his eyes remained open, staring at the shadows in his overstuffed room. But no, his eyes weren't staring at the shadows. That was the problem. His eyes, apparently, were still back at the entrance to Glenwood Fields, and they were stuck in a time loop there, watching the little kid get flung into the ditch over and over and over. Joel groaned and wiped his eyes with the back of his knuckles, as if he could erase the inner film loop by scrubbing it away. It didn't work. Not only was the kid still flying through the air in Joel's mind, now Joel's eyeballs felt like they'd rolled in gravel and been stuck back in his head. His eyes felt scratchy and they stung. Joel sat up and turned on the wrought iron lamp on his nightstand. He rubbed his eyes again and put his head in his hands. He breathed in and out a few times and squared his shoulders. He should go back. He really should. The kid could be alive, just hurt and unable to get out of the ditch. It wasn't terribly cold out tonight, but it was still chilly. The kid had been wearing that dark jacket, dumb kid, so it wasn't going to freeze to death or anything. But what if it was bleeding? Joel had to check on the kid. He stood. He tried to take a step toward the door of his room, but he couldn't. His sense of self-preservation wouldn't let him. Even though his morals wanted him to do the right thing, his survival instinct had a different opinion. It was laying out the facts. The second Joel went to check on the kid, he was committing himself to deep trouble. Even if he could pretend that he hadn't left the scene of the accident, the fact that he knew the kid was in the ditch would be an admission of guilt that he'd hit the kid. His skid marks would prove he was going too fast as he went around that corner. He'd be charged with reckless driving at minimum. And if the kid was dead... Joel started breathing fast, so he sat back down. He hugged himself and rocked back and forth. He knew he was acting like a little kid himself, but he didn't care. He was on the verge of a panic attack. If the kid was dead and Joel admitted that he was the one who hit the kid, Joel would go to jail. No going to LA to break into the music scene, no being free to live his life. If he thought working for a living was his own kind of prison, there was no way he would last long in an actual prison. Joel quickly reached out and turned off his lamp. He got under the covers and pulled them up to his chin. With great determination, he was able to force his eyes closed. He was doing his best to imitate a normal person getting ready to sleep instead of a guilty person too spun up to sleep. Joel's eyes opened again. That was the problem. He was guilty of a crime, and he knew it. He just hit a kid, and he'd fled the scene. He couldn't justify what he'd done the way he could justify leaving work a few minutes early, or getting bad grades, or not taking as many showers as his mom wanted him to take. There was no, hey, that's just who I am, defense for what he'd done. It was wrong. No one could argue differently. Right now, the kid Joel hit could be dying because no one, except Joel, knew the kid was in the ditch. It was wrong. No, it was bordering on downright despicable to leave the kid there. But face it, that's what Joel was going to do. He had to accept it. He wasn't about to get out of bed and go check on the kid and risk getting arrested for what he'd done. He just wasn't. Besides, if the kid was alive, maybe he could get out on his own. Maybe someone else would find him. And if he was dead, what did it matter? When the overhead light in Joel's room went on, it almost literally reached into Joel's bed, scooped him up, and tossed him across the room. The brightness was so shocking that Joel catapulted from his bed and didn't realize what was going on until he was stumbling through a pile of discarded smelly t-shirts. "Rise and shine," his mom said. "What the—" Joel shook his head and blinked, squinting against the brain-searing light that assaulted his eyes. Past sleep-crusted eyelids, he could see his mother standing in the doorway of his room. Her hair was in the top knot she put it in for sleep, and she was wrapped in her red terry cloth robe. "Your dad's in the shower," his mom said. "He'll be ready to go in 15 minutes. I didn't hear your alarm go off, so I figured I should wake you. You better get ready." Joel moaned and began shuffling toward the bathroom. He had to pee, and he needed to do something about the cotton that must have stuffed into his head while he slept. "Joel?" his mother said. He turned and frowned at her. "What? I'm up. I can see that, but move a little faster, would you?" "Oh, was this... Okay, it's mentioning how he doesn't feel normal. Is this going to be another story where the main character ends up, like, becoming something else? Like, he's going to turn into the Kids at Play statue thing or something weird like that? That's the only prediction I can think of right now. I don't know. I wonder where this is going. Joel grimaced and returned to shuffling. He was almost to the bathroom. What did she want him to do? Leap to the toilet in a single bound? "Joel?" He whirled and glared at her. "What?" She sighed. "Take a shower, you stink." Joel turned away from her without answering. He went into the bathroom and shut the door. Hoping his mother would be gone when he came out of the bathroom, Joel peed, splashed water on his face, and pulled on the jeans and t-shirt he left lying on the floor the night before. What was the point in showering and putting on clean clothes when he was going to be sweaty within the first half hour of working at the nursery? Joel faced himself in the mirror. Man, he looked like crap. His usually thick, wavy hair was limp. He looked pale. His eyes were bloodshot. What was wrong with... Oh, yeah, that. Apparently, sometime during the night, Joel had managed the miracle of finding sleep, and when he went to sleep, he'd also had another miracle. He'd forgotten what he'd done. But now he remembered. Joel dropped the toilet seat lid and sat down. He took several deep breaths. His mind started to review what he'd done, but he stopped it. "No!" he snapped. He wasn't doing the replay again today. It was bad enough that he had to get up before 5 a.m. to work. He wasn't going to add a guilt trip on top of it. It might not be too late, his conscience whispered to him. You could go help the kid. He stood up and charged out of the bathroom. He still wore the socks he had on the night before, and he didn't bother changing them. Instead, he stuffed his feet into the dirty shoes he'd kicked off before he dropped into his bed. He unearthed one of his D'Agostino garden center baseball caps from under a pile of dirty socks and jammed it onto his head. He grabbed his wallet and his keys from the pile of sheet music on his desk, and he left his room. He ran into his dad in the hallway. "Good, you're ready," his dad said. Joel grunted, then said, "Let's do this." He followed his dad down the hall, his shoes sinking into the plush gray carpet, and his nostrils twitching in reaction to his dad's powerful, musky cologne. He kept his gaze focused on his dad's precisely trimmed graying black hair and the farmer's tan skin on the back of his neck. Joel kept his brain turned off. His dad trod down the stairs and headed into the kitchen. Joel followed. His mom stood at the counter, still in her robe. She appeared to be watching her coffee brew. The kitchen was filled with the smell of it. Joel's dad stopped to kiss his wife. Joel ignored his parents and went through the utility room and out into the garage. He was getting into his truck when his dad stepped into the garage and pressed the garage door opener. "Why don't we head in together this morning?" Joel's dad asked. "We can stop and get donuts on the way." "Oh, but they're going to stop by the body, aren't they?" Or something, anyway. Joel inwardly cringed, but he was too distracted by what he'd done the night before to argue. He shrugged. Whatever. He closed his truck door and got into his dad's truck. His dad grinned and slid in behind the wheel. 3 dozen donuts coming up, his dad said. 1 dozen plainly glazed, 1 dozen chocolate-covered, and 1 dozen jelly-filled. Joel glanced at his dad and ignored the urge to roll his eyes. It sounded like his dad was giving his order, and they were still in the garage. "Raspberry jelly, of course," his dad continued. "What else?" Joel asked, just to say something. He couldn't have cared less about the donuts. His mind was still stuck in the loop of the kid going into the ditch. Over and over and over. Joel clenched his fists. Should he tell his dad what he did so they could go check on the kid? His dad started his practically new truck with a push of a button and backed down the driveway. He pulled away from his house and accelerated. Joel pressed his lips together and took a deep breath. He was nearly losing it. There was no way he was going to tell his daddy to hit a kid. Why did he even think that? Joel forced himself to look out at the dark street in front of them. He shoved aside the image of the kid in the ditch. Joel usually cut through Glenwood Fields to get to Sally's. The cafe was just outside town, on the opposite and from the garden center. Going through downtown was slower because of the stoplights. Joel hated stoplights. Thankfully, his dad loved driving through downtown, so Joel didn't have to face Glenwood Fields. "Consistency is the key to a good life, Joel," his dad said as he turned onto Main Street. "Same donuts, same customers, same good results." Joel raised an eyebrow at his dad. He so wanted to tell his dad how full of it he was, but instead he turned and looked out the window. As soon as he looked, he was sorry he did, because he glimpsed one of those plastic kids at play figures sitting at the edge of the sidewalk. "Has that always been there?" Joel frowned, and turned to look back at it. The yellowish kid-shaped figure squatted next to a rose bush in front of the last house before the business section of town began. Joel was pretty sure he'd never seen one of those plastic things next to that rose bush. The truck came to a stop, and Joel looked ahead through the windshield. They were at the first of 4 stoplights in the tiny downtown area. The street was deserted because it was still dark out. None of the businesses were open. The street lights and lit-up window displays along the sidewalk cast yellow and pale white glows out onto the empty pavement. A flash of irritation lit up in Joel's mind. How dumb was it that they were sitting here, idling at a stoplight when there wasn't anyone around? Joel shifted in his seat. It was making him nuts sitting here in this truck. He needed to get to the nursery so he could get to work. For once, he looked forward to it. It would take his mind off of... Joel groaned. "You do realize L.A. has nothing but traffic jams and stoplights," his dad said. "Huh?" Joel said. "I can feel your impatience, son," his dad said. "I know you hate stoplights. I was just reminding you that there'll be a lot of them where you plan to go." Joel didn't want to talk about stoplights. That's different. "A stoplight is a stoplight is a stoplight," his dad said. "I've always kind of liked stoplights. Gives you a breather, a chance to look around and notice things." Joel's dad glanced toward the right side of the road. He grinned and pointed. "See, like that, right there. See that pink dress in the window of lovely ladies?" The light turned green, and Joel's dad didn't press on the accelerator. Joel turned to look in the direction his dad was pointing. He nodded when he saw a frilly pink dress. "Lori Unger had a dress just like that when we were in 5th grade. Boy, did I have a crush on her." Joel's dad finally went through the intersection. Joel once again turned to look out the window, but his vision was blurring the storefronts, the lights, and the sidewalk. Instead of seeing downtown, he was seeing the kid in the ditch. It took a couple more minutes to get through the other stoplights. During that time, Joel's dad started rambling about some new kind of fertilizer he wanted to stock. Joel couldn't do anything but grunt in response, because just before the last stoplight, he'd spotted yet another one of those kids at play plastic figures. This one he was sure he'd never seen before. It sat at the corner of Main and 5th, next to the old phone booth by the gas station. There was no way one of those figures had been there a couple days ago, when Joel stopped to get gas. No way. Joel stared at the thing, and he could have sworn it was looking back at him accusingly. But that wasn't possible, right? And after what felt like an eternity, Joel's dad finally pulled into Sally's nearly empty parking lot. It was a few minutes before 5. He drove around to the back of the log cabin-style building. Sally's didn't open until 6, but she started making donuts and sweet rolls in the middle of the night. Joel's dad had a standing order with Sally for 3 dozen donuts every Saturday morning. Joel never saw the point of the donuts, but his dad swore it brought more people into the garden center on Saturdays. Joel's dad dropped his truck near the cafe's back door. "Can you run in and get the donuts?" he asked Joel. "Sure." Joel threw open the passenger door eagerly. He needed to be moving, not sitting still thinking. It was still completely dark outside. Oh, okay, wait. New prediction. Really quickly. I bet the kid was Sally's kid. Just throwing that out there. Completely random guess, but I don't know. It was still completely dark outside. The sun wasn't even debating getting up yet. It was full on asleep behind the mountains in the distance. The quarter moon was still lingering in the sky, shining its weak light down on the craggy outlines of the mountain peaks. Okay, I just read ahead a little bit, and yeah, it looks like my theory might be true, but I'm not sure. There's just a few hints further ahead here that I'm right. Joel had no trouble seeing, though. A glaring spotlight on a pole next to Sally's threw its illumination down over the back door. Even without the light, Joel could have found his way. The aromas of frying oil, sugar, cinnamon, and chocolate wafted out from the partially open doorway. Joel grasped the door's rough handle and pulled it open. "Sally?" he called. She didn't answer, but he stepped inside. The door opened into the huge kitchen that ran along the back of the building. Sally was always in the kitchen in this time of morning, but today she wasn't here. Joel stopped and looked around. He cocked his head and listened. Past the sounds of sizzling oil and the hum of the walking refrigerator, he heard a woman talking. The words were muted, but it sounded like Sally. She had a deep, distinctive, gravelly voice. Joel hesitated, looking around to see if the donuts might just be ready for him to take. Sometimes they were, and he knew his dad paid monthly, so all Joel had to do was pick them up. However, no donut boxes sat on the counter. In fact, very little was on the counters. A mixing bowl was filled with some kind of batter. A couple pans of cinnamon rolls were sitting near the oven. But where were all the cooling racks filled with donuts? Joel took a step toward the voice he could still hear. He called Sally's name again. The voice stopped talking. A scrape preceded a tapping sound, and Sally stepped into the kitchen from the hallway on the far end of it. "Oh, Joel, it's you. Sorry, I'm behind." Sally wiped her eyes and bustled toward Joel. A plump woman with hair dyed even blacker than Joel's was naturally. Sally was probably in her 70s by now. Her face was lined, but it was always cheerful, except for today. Oh, it was, I'm guessing, her grandson or something. Okay. Joel frowned at Sally's smudged mascara, her red lips, eyes, and compressed lips. Red eyes. Oh, red eyes. Oh, okay, never mind. Are you okay?" he asked. He didn't really care how she was, but he figured he should say something. She was obviously not acting normally. "Oh, Joel, no, I'm not okay." Sally perched on a stool near the long marble counter where she rolled dough. Joel was used to seeing that counter filled with cut-out donuts ready for the fryer. Sally looked at the counter as if she was seeing what was usually there, too. "I'm so behind. When I got the news, I just stopped baking. I couldn't even think. I've been on the phone calling people who might have seen him. Talking to Chief Montgomery. He's taking it seriously, thank God." Joel had no idea what Sally was talking about. "I'm sorry," he said. "What news?" As soon as he asked, he knew the answer. This was a small town. It was unlikely that there was some upsetting news that had nothing to do with a child who'd gotten hit by a truck the night before. Or maybe that wasn't true. Maybe Sally's upset had nothing to do with what Joel had done. His mother, even his friends, were always telling him, "It's not about you, Joel." He was jumping to conclusions because he felt guilty. "My grandson is missing," Sally said. "My 5-year-old grandson." Or maybe it was about Joel this time. But first, this video is sponsored by the Elementia Studios Discord. On there, you can chat with other FNAF fans and just fans of the channel. You can showcase your fan art, you can discuss your theories, you can just hang out with cool people. It's fun, you'll like it. So the link will be in the description, so you can check it out if you want to. That's about it. How many little kids in a town this size went missing in a single night? Probably not more than one. Joel had no idea what he should do now. Should he ask questions? That would be the normal thing to do, right? He had to act normal. Not guilty. Normal. "Since when?" Joel blurted. Was that a good first question? Apparently it wasn't a bad one, because Sally immediately answered it. "He wasn't in his bed when my daughter went to check on him, a little after midnight. She stays up late most nights. She's taking night classes, and that's when she studies, after Caleb goes to sleep. She always looks in on him before she goes to bed, and he just wasn't there. Sally reached into the pocket of her pink frilly apron and pulled out a handful of crumpled tissues. She blew her nose on one. Her nose was as red as her eyes. She didn't worry at first, she continued, because Caleb is... She sniffed, waved a hand, and tried a smile that looked more like a grimace. A bit of a mischievous boy. He likes to play pranks. He hates following rules. He's gone off on his own at least a dozen times. He calls his adventures walkabouts. She sniffed again. Joel was having trouble focusing on Sally's words. He had too much going on in his head to listen to her. First, there was his heartbeat, which was, for some reason, resounding off the inside of his skull. Second, there was the replay of the truck hitting the kid. It had a soundtrack in his mind. The squealing tires, the revving engine, the thud. Third, there was his inner dialogue. You should say something. Don't be an idiot. Say nothing. Just play dumb. What if he's still alive? Joel concentrated on turning down the volume on his brain's chatter so he could hear Sally. He didn't really want to hear her, but if he didn't act right when she talked, she could get suspicious. But she looked in all his usual favorite places, in the house, in the neighborhood, even in the woods. She called all his friends' parents, Sally went on. When she still couldn't find him, well, that's when she called me. I told her to call the police. They've been looking for him since... what time is it? She looked at her bare wrist. Joel glanced at his watch. It's 5:03, he said. And you're here for... Dad's donuts. But listen, I'll just go. Joel had to get out of here. Thinking about the kid in the ditch was one thing, but now thinking about Caleb lying in the ditch... No, he couldn't do that. Never mind the donuts, he said quickly. Then he added, that's just awful about your grandson. I'm so sorry. He turned and trotted out of the building before Sally could respond. 3 hours later, his nerves pulled so taut he figured he could probably pluck them in like guitar strings. Joel followed his dad into Herb's Hardware in the middle of town. He had to concentrate to be sure his movements were casual and relaxed, not at all the way he felt. Could he pull off this nonchalant act for the rest of the day? When Joel had returned to his dad's truck, he had to explain why Sally hadn't made the donuts. And of course, his dad had immediately gotten out of the truck and gone inside to talk to Sally. Not sure what he should do, Joel had remained in the truck, where he'd sat stiffly, chewing on his thumbnail. He wasn't sure how long he'd sat there. Pretty long, he figured, because the sun was rising when his dad came back out. Joel nearly jumped through the truck roof when his dad threw open the truck door and got back in. The police chief is organizing a search, he said. Joel blinked at his dad. Huh? His dad shot him a look. For Caleb, they're organizing a search. Joel nodded and swallowed. He cleared his throat. Has anyone seen... He began. He was uneasy about asking any questions. What if someone had seen his truck near Glenwood Fields last night? Joel's dad started his truck and put it in gear. Montgomery... Montgomery Gator! And his officers are going door to door now. So far, no one said they saw anything. It was all Joel could do not to jump up and yell, yes! That was one thing he could set aside. All the time that he'd been telling himself he should go back and check on the kid, a nagging thought had been in the back of his mind. What if someone had seen what he'd done? No one had. So, if he said nothing, if he kept acting clueless, no one would know. He could go on with his life as if it never happened. Yeah, as if he could forget it. We need to get back to the nursery, Joel's dad said. I want to get the deliveries loaded while I do a few things in the office. We'll open for a couple hours, but then we'll close up. We'll go help out with the search. Close? Joel yelped. The only day he'd ever wanted to work, and they were going to close? Help with the search? Joel didn't want to be anywhere near the search. It's the right thing to do if Caleb isn't found right away. I've already talked to Montgomery on the phone. I told him we'll head over to the hardware store later this morning and get what we need to make some signs, and maybe a command center for the search. And here they were. Okay, so as the search begins for this missing child, and as things are guaranteed to get more dark, let us take a break for now. We'll come back with part 3, hopefully tomorrow, and I'll see you guys then. Let me know what you think so far. This is getting pretty interesting. I heard the villain for this one is really weird, but so far I'm assuming it's that statue kid thing. I don't know. We'll see, I guess. Alright, thank you for listening. See you then. Bye-bye.